Hello again. This is the moderator waiting for you to enter our panel and our next session, which is going to be on environmental justice. And I'm happy to present Flurina Schneider to you. She will take over in a few minutes. And as we're waiting for everybody to enter and have a seat and get ready, I would like to ask her what. Hi, hello, Florina. Nice to see you again. The last time we met in real life was when you presented the Faktencheck, a very big, like a 10-kilo book on all the facts on biodiversity in Germany, the real situation, which is a must read for any politician in Germany, I think. And now we're having a look on the global sale on environmental justice, right?
Yeah, hi Tanya. It's very nice to talk to you again. It was really a very nice moment where the Faktencheck was handed over to the politicians after seeing so many scientists working on this tremendous evaluation on all these different levels, from how biodiversity develops until how transformative change can be fostered. And now here we are looking at a little bit a different topic in the session who is coming. It's not about Germany, it's about the international relations and biodiversity conservation, right?
So we are nearly ready to start. And I think people are entering. We should give them a few more minutes. And then we're ready to start. I'm looking forward to this session. We, as journalists, we had a lot of research on, well, the telecoupled effects on our consumer culture. And so I'm really delighted to see that you're taking a deeper look into this connection. And well, I'm really curious who you invited to talk.
Yes, I'm also very excited to listen to the four excellent speakers who will join the session in a few minutes. And yeah, they will talk from empirical examples to theoretical thoughts to conceptual ideas. So it's really a very nice combination.
It's 2 o'clock, and there are many more participants who have just entered the room now with maybe having their coffee mug in their hand, and you can have a look at mine. My favorite mug is this. So welcome back. I hope you had a nice break and you enjoyed the poster session and you also got into contact with some of the other participants. We are now about to start session 2, which is about biodiversity conservation and environmental justice in a global world that is connected via very old trade routes that are also linked, I think, to the export of ideas of the concepts of nature, maybe of the Western mindset of seeing nature as a resource that is to be exploited. And many other lines are connecting the global north and the global south. And now we will start an inquiry into these north-south linkages, and we will start in the Republic of Congo and then move towards a more global or theoretical inquiry on the great question on environmental justice. Flurina Schneider will be the chair of this session, and she is a geographer and a professor for social ecology and transdisciplinarity at the Goethe University in Frankfurt Main. And she's also the scientific director of ISOE, which is the Institute for Social Ecological Research. So I'm really curious what we will learn from you and the other panelists who will present. Over to you, Florina. Looking forward to a great session.
Thanks a lot for this introduction. So I can directly jump in with this session. I have a little slide presentation that will be shared immediately, and you can go directly to the second slide. Thank you. This session is basically about the interlinkages between biodiversity conservation and environmental justice, because we are convinced that we need to think these two issues together. Just a few examples. The growing living standards, particularly in the global north, they lead to destructions of ecosystems, and this not only in the global north, but in particular also in the global south. So this is one example of telecoupling. Another example of telecoupling is that conservation is increasingly externalized to biodiversity hotspots in low-income regions of the global south, while the growing demands for resources like soy or lithium are simultaneously met with the imports from these countries. So you see that justice, conservation of biodiversities, they are not only linked, they are somehow really linked across large distances, and that's what we call telecoupling. But it's not only if, let's say, there are flows of goods and money and other types of products over the distance, but sometimes it's also the more social distances. For example, when urban communities invest in nature and wilderness conservation, while often ignoring the needs of the realities of the local population. So this is somehow the background of the session, and now I'm very happy to give over to our 4 speakers. So on the next slide, an overview. We will start with Grace Wong from the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature, RIN, in Kyoto, Japan. And due to the distance to Japan, unfortunately, she cannot be present now due to the time difference. So it's already early in the night at her place. So she will give her talk as a video presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending my talk. It's a pleasure for me to give a talk today at the FEdA International Conference. Even though global technology has allowed us to participate from around the world, unfortunately, time zones do not allow us to participate always from around the world. The title of my talk today is on financial flows, examining the diverging interests and injustice in frontier forest governance in Mai Ndombe in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So that is me, together with all my co-authors from University of Helsinki, as well as from C4 ICRAF and the Stockholm Resilience Center. Okay, first I would like to give a small introduction to REDD+ and Mai Ndombe. REDD+, as you may know, is the mechanism for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. Mai Ndombe is the pilot site for DR Congo's national REDD+ strategy. The entire province is a green continent. The entire province of 12.3 million hectares, of which approximately 9.8 million hectares is forested. The entire province is a REDD+ site, essentially. So REDD+ in this area is implemented in a landscape where local people, smallholders, indigenous people, and large-scale conservation interests and forest concessions compete within a rather limited space. And as a little bit of context, the DR Congo has been promoted by the global community as a solution country for climate change. It's a solution country because of its carbon-dense forests and peat swamps, but it also has a wealth of minerals that are required for clean technologies. So, it's seen as a solution country, but yet the government of DRC is pushing for logging and for oil exploration as important sources of investments. So this dilemma, this dichotomy is creating very contentious land uses in the country. So this chart by Carbon Brief outlines how deforestation and emissions are increasing rapidly, particularly over the last decade. And while the country has a very low fossil fuel consumption, it is actually, because of land use change, one of the 12 highest emitting country. And deforestation, as you can see, has climbed steeply. So how is the problem of deforestation framed by the government of DRC and from the REDD+ donor community? In a lot of the policy documents that we've reviewed, the direct drivers of deforestation are the smallholder activities of slash and burn agriculture, artisanal logging, charcoal, and wood collection. These are essentially, the livelihood practices of all the smallholder and indigenous communities in DRC. And even though this is, promoted, as the same, this assumption is kind of being repeated again and again. More recently, the Congo Basin Forest Declaration Assessment also highlighted how much of the smallholder-driven forest loss occurs in already degraded secondary forests and in mosaic landscapes, while it is the industrial activities that are more likely to drive deforestation in primary forests. So again, some of the indirect drivers of deforestation within policy documents are around population growth, infrastructure, urbanization, economic crisis, and so on. So it is important to know how deforestation is framed because this is where REDD Plus projects and REDD Plus funding go towards. So the sort of alternative activities that are being promoted are, alternative agriculture and also population control. And just to highlight a little bit of the issue of population growth, DRC has a population of approximately 2.3 million people with a density of approximately 48 people per kilometer square. In Germany, where you are sitting, it's 232 people per kilometer square. In Japan, where I'm sitting, is 339 per kilometer square. Yet in none of these countries is population growth an issue, but in DRC, population growth is an issue and is assumed to drive deforestation. So REDD Plus, in its inception and in its conception, is designed to shift the incentives around forest and forest conservation. And by giving value to standing forests, it is to deliver change away from the business as usual practices of deforestation. So our research questions then is to ask, is REDD Plus providing the right incentives to the right actors? And are these policy incentives effective within a landscape of competing land users' interests and also related financial flows? Thus, our big question is, can REDD Plus finance actually lead to transformative change in forest and land use decisions? The theoretical framing that we're using is around global political economy, which assumes the relationships and the interlinked relationships and decision making between state, society, and markets in forest governance. And we apply a critical lens of critical global political economy that focuses on not only these interlinked relationships, but also focuses on who carries the burdens in global forest governance and who is marginalized in those decisions. And also, we take a perspective that acknowledges historical, social, and geographic context in this construction of political and economics situations in the country. In addition, we also apply a telecoupling approach to explore flows of finance and commodities because understanding that a lot of finance and uh, material and basically non-material flows coming into a landscape and out of the landscape is also an important component of how decisions are made in the forest sector. And thus far, studies have generally overlooked the unequal impacts of these causal relations. And so we are trying to bring in the examination of global financial flows and its implications for local people, local land use change. Our methodology really focuses on open source research to understand flows and how flows impact land use change. So it's really a three-step process. We drew on the land use databases of Moabi and the Interactive Forest Atlas of WRI. We overlay land use activities from forest concession agreements, mining, REDD Plus projects. These are the land use types that we have data for and overlay that onto forest cover, the forest cover change. And then we examined for the concessions and for the mining agreements, we identified the companies for each forest concession and mining and REDD+ project, and we looked to the land matrix and the open land contract databases to examine these. We then search for those companies, information on them from Orbis and Open Corporates databases. So we determine the company ownership, the structure, and the country of origin. And this is to track company ownership with shareholders and subsidiaries. For example, we also look at, we cross-check this also with, for example, information on government reports and other type of publicly available data. So this publicly, we also look at public media as a source of information in terms of NGO reports, investigative journalism. So we try to triangulate both where the concessions and companies are operating, where the companies are from and their ownership structure, and also to look at NGO reports and investigative journalism as a triangulation. So what we want to examine then is to construct an understanding of the flow of finance and the benefits. We know this is very much available information that international donors are providing climate finance into Mai Ndombe, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, for example, the World Bank Forest Investment Program, the Central Africa Forest Initiative. These provide over $125 million into REDD+ thus far. We also look at then from the company databases and the concessions, the extractive industries and operating information. And these include forestry concessions, oil and mining concessions, as well as livestock cattle raising. These companies are linked to a complex network of parent companies, often registered in different countries, with different kind of setups and different financing structures. So you can see there where some of the Sodafor, for example, which is one of the largest forest concession company, is linked to Nord-Süd Timber, which is based in Liechtenstein, and Comico Sonahydrate, which is about oil and gas, is linked to both the Central Oil and Gas Company of UK as well as the state of DRC. So we tracked all of these companies and their parent companies, which I will talk a little bit more in the coming slides. And then we try to trail where are the benefits from these land use activities. In terms of climate finance, we could say it generates global climate mitigation benefits. In terms of the parent companies of the extractive industries in DRC, they might be generating taxes to the countries of the parent companies as well as profits to their shareholders. At the national level, a lot of the extractive industries might be generating tax revenues to DRC Treasury, and a small proportion of this is to local communities. So, as I've mentioned, we've trailed REDD+, we've trailed forest carbon and mining sectors, and you can see there's a lot of business as usual actors, both in the international donor arena related to REDD+, as well as forestry carbon, and also in mining, which has political ties with the family and friends of the former President Kabila. We also look at the actors and the interests. Donors have been supporting REDD+, but they are reinforcing the problem framing of deforestation as caused by local communities, while choosing perhaps to ignore extractive industries and large-scale drivers, so creating injustice in that way. In terms of the private companies, there are a lot of companies from China in the timber business and in artisanal logging from Europe and Canada. A lot of the concessions have been changed from timber concessions to carbon concessions, speculating that a lot of the valuable timber has already been logged. And in the third group of domestic elites and armed groups, there is a lot of political ties. There is a lot of speculation around companies, and it also has a lot of violence and armed groups tied to these businesses. So let's get to very quickly to the discussion. I have a minute left in my talk. So is REDD+ providing the right incentives to the right actors? And we would say no. The problem framing of smallholders is unjust and causing injustices because local people are forced to change their practices and are squeezed into ever smaller and smaller spaces. Incentives to reduce deforestation are mostly directed to companies, and other green development strategies more emphasize, global benefits, local benefits, but only 4% of legal benefits are legally allocated to local communities. So are incentives effective? We would also say no, because while REDD+ finance is rather large, existing extractive interests are much bigger. And a lot of the power structures of finance really uphold business as usual. The DRC government is setting up new regulations for a carbon market and has also set up systems for a kind of a more neoliberal approach to carbon as part of this new climate economy signed during the COP in Glasgow. So this is my last slide. As conclusion, does REDD+ finance lead to transformative change? Well, REDD+ and Mai Ndombe has really limited influence among all these dominant investments. And while REDD+ and other interests always make the same promise of development and prosperity, that new incentives will, actually benefit the local, there is still really a lack of a is what we argue. So we believe that our study will contribute towards transformative change in a modest way by uncovering the interconnected power dynamics of capital, discursive power, as also commodity flows that tends to hold, the business as usual system in place. And we also contribute to the methodological contribution of telecoupling. Okay, and finally, I think what we are trying to do is unpack a long holding system of inequality and injustice and talk and hopefully such studies will inform the need, which I think the need is always there and perhaps people know, but it's really to consciously unpack the system of inequality that are in place. So thank you very much. I'm running out of time. We have a small info brief out. This paper is in review at World Development, and the QR code directs you to the project that is supporting this work, Fair Frontiers. Thank you.
So a big thank to Grace Wong for this very nice introduction into the session, an empirical case on how conservation practices and inequality are linked together in a telecoupled system. Unfortunately, you saw it was a video. She cannot take questions, but she let me know that if you anyhow have questions, just inform me and I can hand them over to her later. So this is also an information for if you have questions, please use the F&A function at the bottom line of the Zoom window. So after each of the talks, we will have a very few questions of understanding, and then after the 3 coming talks, a general discussion. With that, I'm very happy to welcome now Sébastien Boillat. He is from Bern University and of Applied Sciences and University of Neuchâtel from Switzerland. And he will now talk deeper on questions of justice in telecoupled systems. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Flurina. Thank you for the whole team for the invitation and also for the opportunity to be part of this very nice conference. So my talk will start with a picture. And here you can see it's an observation tower that has fell into disrepair. And this is actually located in the Tunari National Park in Bolivia. And this tower has something to do with telecoupling because it was actually financed by a Swiss development cooperation project many years ago. And after the project left, then the observation tower was no longer maintained. And so this is an example to show that conservation initiatives are also, in a sense, telecoupled. They are telecoupling processes too. And so that's what I propose to explore with this talk. So let's see the next one. Okay. So I will talk about what I mean with telecoupling and those environmental initiatives, what I mean with telecoupling and environmental justice. And then I will show you two examples, two studies that I have performed with my colleagues that have to do with telecoupling aspects in conservation and agroecological initiatives. First, what do I understand with telecoupling? I think you probably, most of the audience know already, but just to make a small reminder. So basically, we're talking about social ecological connections over distances. We're looking at flows, but we're also looking at the actor networks and also at the governance aspect and the impact, social ecological impacts in different systems. With environmental initiatives, I'm talking about anything that has the aim to modify the local social ecological system to ensure that the biodiversity and natural resources are being conserved in the long term. So in some sense, it meets global interest, but also sometimes local interests. When we see what does the objectives on the research questions first, so the idea is to ask, how does the telecoupled nature of those environmental initiatives, so when those initiatives are tied to distant flows, how do they influence the social, local, ecological outcomes? And also, how can we investigate and evaluate aspects of justice in these processes? And finally, we can ask also a more theoretical, but also methodological question. What is the best way to combine those two frameworks? Because telecoupling and justice are basically two different frameworks that we try to combine. Okay. So when we look at the literature on telecoupling and environmental conservation, we see different approaches. One of the first approach, also by the first researcher that deal with telecoupling, was what I call conservation and telecoupling. So we take a context and we look at the different telecoupling process and the conservation being one of them, but we basically look at the flows and the actors. But there is also another concept which is called conservation versus telecoupling. So you can imagine you have a context and you have flows of timber or agricultural products that affect biodiversity, and then conservation would be like a response to try to control those flows to protect the area. The focus I want to show here is what we call conservation as telecoupling. So it means that we consider the conservation initiatives or the environmental initiatives more generally also as a telecoupling process that often depends on flows that are very often also distant flows. And this will be the case in many contexts of the global south and anywhere. So we look at the flows that support conservation in some sense, and how do these flows compete with other processes of resource extraction. What do I understand with justice? This is a very classic framing that you will see now everywhere. And basically, this framing was based on the work of Nancy Fraser, but also other political philosophers. And it has been applied to conservation context. You can find literature on that. And there is a set of indicators that have been developed by those researchers that try to find proxies for the indication of justice in those three dimensions. So basically, what we did is trying to open up those dimensions of justice, trying to look at, on the one hand, the unequal exchange of resource money, but also ecosystem services and nature contribution to people, trying to look at power relation, how can actors bridge those distances and how they gain power with that. And finally, also recognition aspects that also include the inclusion or not of local and indigenous knowledge and value and conceptions of nature. Okay. So I'm going to the first study. The first study takes what I call the framework-based approach. So the idea is really we define boxes and we fill the boxes using literature, using interviews, using empirical data, and so on. So we combine the telecoupling framework here in the sense that we look at distant systems, we look at the flows, and we look at the local systems. And then we look at those flows in the conservation telecoupling and also in competing telecouplings for land and resources. And then we look at the outcome of every telecoupling process in terms of justice from the point of view of the local community. And then we open the boxes of all those indicators. So what are the results? This is a study we did with 4 protected areas in different countries. And then we just rate also the justice outcome in a sense of a 3 scale, in a sense that equitable, partly equitable, or inequitable for each of those different telecoupling process. So you can imagine you have here a protected area, you have the conservation, which is funded by NGOs in Europe and in the US, but you also have the extraction of timber and other resources that in this case flow mainly to Asia. And of course, in return, there are money returns in this sense. So we all group those flows in so-called telecoupling processes, and then we investigate the effect on local social ecological justice. And what we observe is that in the 4 cases, the conservation was very dependent on distant flows. And at some point in time, those flows were cut. And then the other telecoupling process took over. So you have a very fast and devastating episodes of resource extraction. When the conservation, the protected area was no longer funded, then it went very fast and the resources were extracted. And both processes are affected by patterns of social exclusion that don't really benefit the local communities. And the conservation also often outwent benefits in terms of burden, with the exception of the Galapagos, in which the population could get quite a good income from tourism. Okay. This is another approach for another study that we did is what we call the network-based approach. So instead of filling boxes, we try to find how power relationships are expressed in the telecoupled flows. And so in this case, we examine agroecological initiatives in Senegal, and we look at where does the funding come from, where does the knowledge come from, etc. And so we perform a social network analysis, and you can observe here that most of the funding comes from also from Europe and North America, and there are very few South-South connections. And then we also ask who control those flows? What are the organizations that control these flows? And here you can see in the network, those who have a central position in the network, so what we call the betweenness centrality, have more power because they control those flows. And you see that farm worker unions, who are the local actors who implement agroecology, they have a very marginal position, and the flows are mainly controlled by NGOs. In this case, they are either national or local branches of European NGO or Senegalese NGOs as well. And the initial source of funds are almost always getting back to European cooperation and research agencies. So what can we learn about that? First is the idea to compare this framework and network approach, because they have different framings. So in the framework approach, what is interesting is that you can identify clearly the identification of justice dimension. You can also compare more easily. But the con is that it's rather top-down because you already predefine the boxes that you fill. And it's also a bit difficult to conceptualize the relationship, and you can, at the end, focus only on one single actor. So justice would be as an outcome in this sense. In the network approach, you have more justice as a process because it's a way of distributing power. And then the pros is that it's a more bottom-up approach, but you don't have direct link with justice. You have to pass through the idea of who is winning and who is losing power. So further research could combine the two, and also suggest that we could dig deeper into how the local actors perceive what is just and what is unjust in specific situations. Also, the thematic discussion in the two cases, in the 4 protected area and also in the agroecological network, we find that those environmental initiatives are strongly dependent on distant flows, and especially linking the global south with the global north. That there is also a competition of environmental initiatives with other telecoupling process. In this case, it can be resource extraction, but also agribusiness in the case of agroecology. You have a very strong persistence of colonial discourses in the two, in conservation, but also in agroecology. So we often blame poverty or backwardness as a cause of environmental degradation, when actually there is also another telecoupling process that has this impact. There is a tendency of what I would call the anger chain, is in a sense of you have the boss yelling at the employee yelling at his or her partner, and the partner yelling at the kids, and the kids yelling at the cat. No, so the conservation organization, they cannot blame directly the big extractor. They cannot act against them because they are too powerful, and then they fall back into blaming the local communities and the local smallholders. But this is something we observe a lot on the ground. And also they say, well, they will integrate indigenous knowledge, but actually underground, this is very rare that you really have a co-production of knowledge and taking that knowledge into account. So what can we do? Possible levers would be also those NGO, those conservation actors could also try to act on the distant demand system that are the systems that compete with them for the resources, and try to raise awareness there. But also an important aspect would be that the local communities should also have a more diversification of resource and knowledge sources when they want to implement those initiatives, and not depend on a single actor in the global north. Okay, this would be everything for my talk now. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward in hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. That was really interesting and somehow very much confirmed what Grace Wong was already telling before. I see no questions in the F&A functions, so I'm just bridging a little bit in case somebody is asking, but basically this might be just a good sign because it was very clear, and I'm sure that many discussion contributions will then follow at the end. So it seems that no questions are coming. So just for the next presentations, if you have questions, you can direct them, you can type them in directly so that they are immediately visible. And with that, I go further to our next speaker, Jens Newig. And he will now welcome Jens. He will now talk more on the governance aspect of telecoupling. And I'm very looking forward to listen to your talk.
Hello, thank you, Flurina, for the nice invitation. And let's see if I can share my screen here. Does it work? Can everyone see? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Great. Yes. So yeah, so quite interesting discussions already on telecoupling, and what I'll try to do and now is give some maybe also some conceptual notions on what is the governance of telecoupling and what kinds of issues we're dealing with that. So I'm kind of coming from the governance field, more sort of the political science perspective here. And then let's see how we tie things together in the discussion. Okay, so first of all, perhaps a bit of a recap. So what are we talking about when we are using the notion of global telecoupling, and how is that related actually to governance? Again, two concepts that probably need some clarification. So kind of historically, maybe. So a while ago, so maybe 10 years ago, the global governance literature sort of began to feel that something is missing. So what global governance people were doing, they were studying governance that was already there. So big policies, EU, UN, and so on. But they were sort of thinking, okay, maybe we're kind of missing out on something here. And then kind of at the same time, also around 10 years ago, like the notion of telecoupling made popular by Liu and Ekin was already cited. So this notion of, well, there is distant connections somehow, and these distant connections have implications in very different ways also to sustainability. And there is sort of a governance gap, like Ekin said, that's sort of an ungoverned process. So these two actually mean or meant for those of us who are in the governance crowd, that it might be useful to take more a problem-oriented perspective. So take more sort of look at what are the problems, the telecoupled issues, and then look at how can these be governed, and maybe also what attempts are there already to govern these. In a project, we did a little sort of study on what actually is the link between governance and telecoupling. And the more we delved into it, we saw that there's maybe three different perspectives we can distinguish. So the first is that governance, like state-based, for example, actually induces telecoupling. So through, let's say, trade agreements and so forth. And then we've got a perspective, number two, that governance also coordinates telecoupling, so makes it possible somehow, which is then often like chains of corporate governance of global value chains, for example. And then lastly, and this is what we're talking about mostly here, is sort of the governance that responds to telecoupling. So like sustainability governance that looks at, well, what are the unsustainable effects of governance and how can we maybe alleviate them through a variety of instruments. So what makes, from a governance perspective, what makes telecoupling actually so challenging? And here we were looking at a range of sort of types of globalized governance. So we can have what has been termed, let's say, the local cumulative problems. So where like lots of things happen across the world and they somehow add up to something that is global, maybe global biodiversity loss, for example. Then we have transboundary issues where something, maybe a pollutant or water or whatever, is transferred from one region to another region. So that's also maybe somehow global. And on the far right-hand side here, we have these global commons issues like global CO2, global warming, and so on. And then we've got these sort of telecoupled issues where something in one part of the world is impacting relatively specifically on something in another part of the world. And as you can sort of see, if you look at the table here, is that the literature on all the other three types of globalized environmental problems is somehow established, whereas sort of this telecoupled phenomenon hasn't received really so much attention. So we're only actually really starting to deal with that. And if we're looking in particular at the challenges that are involved in telecoupling, we see here, for example, that there's knowledge deficit, so we don't know really what are the effects of telecoupling. We have diverging interests. I'll tell a little example on that. Often in creating governance solutions, there are often high transaction costs because it's so difficult to get this about. Often the legitimacy basis of governance solutions is relatively weak, like private standards, for example. And overall, we're kind of faced with an pretty incoherent and fragmented governance landscape. So yeah, pretty tough, actually. So what to do here? What are the leverage points? Where can governance, where can policy actually hook on? And you've seen a similar picture like this previously. So where we have, let's say, one region, and that is receiving imports from another region, for example, so as basis of a telecoupled system, and where can governance sort of come in? So on the one hand, let's say a region, let's say that's in the global north, that is receiving raw material from the global south, that can try to govern sort of its own local impacts. It can only also try to govern the flow. And it can also try sort of, and this is the most distant, it can also try to do something about the social and ecological impacts in the exporting country, for example. Then, of course, the exporting country itself can also do something, and also the international realm, like international accords and agreements, can also try to govern sort of all the negative consequences of telecoupled governance. Okay, just a very quick example here. Many of you will have heard about that, or maybe are also familiar with that. So the soy production and trade between Brazil and Europe. So yeah, quite clear. So it's used mostly for animal feed in Europe. So Brazil's plays quite an important role here. And then we have sort of, especially in Brazil, local negative consequences. So that is pesticide use, it's deforestation, it's water usage, and so on. So lots of negative sustainability impacts. Like here's a relatively recent paper published in Science that also looked at, so what is the share of soy production in deforested land, and they also come to quite some alarming conclusions here. So now what about the governance? So what to do here? And historically meaning, so you can see the timeline here from the 1970s up to sort of the mid 2010s, there were private standards. So private companies getting together with NGOs and try to look at, okay, how can we sort of develop procedures and have them audited. For example, that soy is grown and traded in a more sustainable way. And you see sort of already like quite an extensive landscape of different private initiatives, private standards in this sector. So it's even hard to kind of keep up with this development. And just to pick two here, the one is maybe the best known, actually, the RTRS, the Roundtable Responsible Soy, funded by Unilever and WWF. And then there is another called Proterra, for example. I don't want to go into all the details, but it's about sort of, they try to trace soy, of course, backed, but the way they do it is, for example, only through book and claim. So it's not clear sort of which soybean really comes from where. So overall, these labels, these private initiatives through multi-stakeholder initiatives, they have remained relatively limited in their effect also, and you can see this on the table here. So the data is not fully up to date, so from 2016, but it hasn't changed so much. So where you can see that the actual percentage of certified soy exported to Europe is actually relatively little. Furthermore, in these initiatives, multi-stakeholder private standards initiatives, we have kind of what we can call maybe corporate capture. Corporate companies try to sort of water standards down, and even also the monitoring and auditing effects are often lacking in effectiveness. So just to tie this back to these challenges of telecoupled governance, so there are still these knowledge deficits on deforestation. So what's actually happening in Brazil, and research is also trying, of course, to help here, but it's not so easy, especially if soy cannot be traced fully. Plus, we have diverging interests, right? So the global community and also these labels, they they look at different aspects, for example, more deforestation, whereas local people, for example, are suffering from different things, like from chemicals contamination, which hasn't been discussed so much at the international level. Makes it also difficult to really develop rules and guidelines that are effective. Just very quickly, some insights from a systematic literature review that we did a few years ago. So where we compared 120 articles studying telecoupling with environmental impacts and also the governance of telecoupling here. For those who are interested in sort of the social science conceptual frameworks, so most revolve around like global value chains, but you can also see sort of global environmental governance, critical political economy. You see land system science here, political economy with a bit of overlap, so quite a diverse picture of conceptual perspectives. Actually, in these 120 papers, the flows, the telecoupled flows were sort of these, so also quite diverse. So we can see soya here, sort of 10 papers studied soya, for example. And here we also saw or looked at the environmental impacts that these telecoupled flows had, and we differentiate them whether these occurred in the sending system, so like the exporting system, if you wish, like 70% of papers report on exporting systems, and then the receiving systems and some other. And we see, for example, that biodiversity here also figures relatively prominent as an environmental impact in these telecoupled flows. Then, of course, since we're interested in governance, we looked at the governance instruments, and a bit surprisingly, we found that lots of governance studied in these empirical studies on telecoupling actually are sort of classical legislation and regulation, whereas only second come in the voluntary labeling standards and so on, and then also some others, of course. And we were looking at, well, sort of where is this governance occurring? So if we kind of have this previous picture in mind, so we can kind of see that most that is actually happening in the sending system. So if thinking of the soy case, it would be happening within Brazil. The receiving system is only doing some of the governance, but we can see that the receiving system is trying to govern more of the sending system than the other way around. And also we see that at least through the literature that we see. And also that we see that the global system is also being quite active here. So if we zoom in again on soy trade here, we can see sort of the sending systems here, Brazil, by far the most important, and the receiving systems here, Europe, but also China being studied, and the governance instruments you can see again, sort of perhaps most interesting for social scientists. So the RTRS, the Roundtable of Responsible Soy, so by far the most studied governance instrument in this. So just a short outlook. So what's been happening in the past years, especially in the realm of due diligence laws? Lots of things have happened. So probably many will be aware of the recent initiatives. So where we know a lot about these private labeling approaches and their sort of relatively manifest ineffectiveness, the effect of these corporate due diligence laws is pretty unclear right now because they are so new. So some of them are just being developed. Some of them, like the German Lieferkettengesetz or the French Loi de Vigilance, for example, they are in place already, but lots of the other directives, they are just to be passed. So their effects on trying to impact producer country sustainability through targeting the corporations is a sort of relatively new aspect. It's not unclear what the effects will be. A second option is to have trade agreements, so like the EU-Mercosur agreement, for example, or some of you may have heard about this, like compensation mechanisms like the Yasuni ITT initiative in Ecuador from 2001, so where in the national park, like oil was underground, highly biodiverse area, and the question was, so sort of, can this not just be compensated? So cannot the international community simply pay Ecuador to leave the oil underground, leave the area untouched? But it hasn't worked out so far, really. But this is sort of also a governance mechanism that could potentially work. So there's lots of things, lots of governance ideas around, but empirically we don't know so much about them yet because many of these just haven't been tested. Those are the references, and thank you very much for listening and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Very interesting. And I just realized I did not introduce you. So Jens Newig is from the Leuphana University in Lüneburg. And I found it also now very interesting to hear more about the governance aspects and how governance connects to telecoupling and also the challenges that are related to governing telecoupled flows. I'm looking again at the question and answer box. Nothing is there, so it probably means that also this talk was very clear. And we go to our next presenters before we then can enter a discussion altogether. So our next presenters are two women. I'm waiting until they are here. Yes, so it's Shelby Matevich. On the one hand, she is from University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And then we have Louise Carver from the Fundación FEdA2024 Spain. Great. So I hand over to you on a next speak, which will now have a quite different perspectives than the other one, presenting also a different concept to look at the questions of conservation. The floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you everyone so much for joining this discussion. Before I get started, I'll just say a little bit more about myself and let my colleague introduce herself a little bit further. So I'm from the United States, but I've been living in the Netherlands for about the last 10 years. I'm currently doing a PhD at University of Amsterdam on conservation entrepreneurship. Prior to that, I was working on funding for the Convivial Conservation Center. I will tell you more about that later. Just to say that my academic background is environmental science, wildlife ecology, degrowth economics, things like this, but I've also spent quite a bit of time in the nonprofit sector. In fact, most of my career has been spent evaluating corporate sustainability with the World Benchmarking Alliance. Louise, do you want to jump in and say a bit more about yourself?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you. I'm Louise. I'm from England, but I work with a contemporary art research and advocacy platform called TBA21 that's based in Madrid that combines transdisciplinary research with artistic and cultural production, including, well, specifically actually around ocean literacy. And they are involved in a marine conservation program in Jamaica, which I'm going to be discussing with you in a moment. But my background is human geography. I did my PhD in biodiversity offsetting, looking at the valuation turn, and in general, the sort of neoliberal trends towards conservation that we just heard so much about with these previous speakers. So yes, I think I'll probably leave it there.
Thank you. Okay, so quick outline to let you know where we're going with this. I will start by giving a background on convivial conservation, our theory of change, and introduce the group that has been working on this. I'll then hand over to my colleague Louise, who will think through telecoupling a little bit more with us, particularly in a case study on our project she's working on in Jamaica, the idea of this emerging blue economy, and a specific concept around protected or promoted rather than protected areas. Okay, so why convivial conservation? So the context to which convivial conservation responds is increasingly clear. It's outlined quite well in the latest EPAS global assessment report, but it's called out by many others, even at this conference as well. And that is that the biodiversity crisis is bad, it's getting worse, and current approaches won't be enough to protect nature, nor to do so in a way that's just to people. Further, not only do we need innovative conservation actions, we need transformative change outside direct biodiversity protection. So transformation across our economic, social, and political spheres as well. Convivial conservation sees two problems in mainstream conservation that makes it very difficult to tackle these problems. The first is a separation between people and nature. The concern here is where conservation contributes to the displacement, poverty, and inequality of local communities for the sake of biodiversity protection. Devaluing and severing relations between people and the nature they have always lived beside. You could think here of conservation's colonial legacy, starting with the Yellowstone model in North America and exported around the world, up to today, where targets like the Global Biodiversity Framework's 30 by 30 or ideas like half-Earth conservation can sound worryingly neo-colonial, perpetuating these same problems. The second problem is unjust and unsustainable forms of economic growth. The concern here is that conservation fails to recognize that the global capitalist economy and its increasing material throughput is the fundamental contributor to the biodiversity crisis. Instead of calling attention to the intolerable pressures that economic growth has put on biodiversity and the planet, conservation instead encourages more growth, but with a conservation twist. So you can think here of ideas like ecotourism, biodiversity credits, and offset markets, and corporate partnerships with conservation NGOs. So then what is convivial conservation? Well, convivial conservation looks for an approach beyond protected areas and beyond market-based mechanisms. Convivial, literally living with conservation, positions conservation as moving from protection to connection, encouraging coexistence, biodiversity, and justice in conservation. And for convivial conservation, the two main problems, which I mentioned on the previous slide, separation and economic growth, then require two almost obvious solutions or responses. The first is to restore human-nature relations. So instead of protected areas, rather let us create promoted areas and encourage engaged visitation, where people are welcome visitors and dwellers living with nature in diverse ways. And next is to transform the global economy. So here, convivial conservation envisions nature as commons, resisting the further commodification of nature and redistributing the wealth and resources we already have in support of local stewardship and reparations. So those two key ideas for convivial conservation are supplemented by a broader manifesto, which has been drafted by the Convivial Conservation Center. And these values are intended to guide critical conservation research, conservation practices, and policy work. If you want to learn more about these, you can click on the link at the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, I can't elaborate too much now because I want to just go directly into the theory of change, or how we anticipate that convivial conservation can actually happen. So this theory of change for convivial conservation is grounded in actors, time, and power. And a methodology that supports this is called biodiversity impact chains, or to say it briefly, BICs. So BICs ensure that the full story of biodiversity crisis is told, one that draws attention to all the factors from the bottom up to the top down. First, BICs account for local and extra-local actors. So this is where local actors, who are those living in or near conservation places and are often the focus of conservation efforts or interventions, is connected to the extra-local actors, or the less often discussed actors, those who live far from conservation spaces, but put great pressure on them all the same. These are often wealthy individuals, Western consumers, corporations, or multilateral institutions. Next is time. In the short term, This means using a kind of do what we can approach for conservation action. So halting destruction from direct drivers like deforestation and like land use change, and this is more commonly practiced in conservation. But this short-term work must be linked to a longer-term vision. Otherwise, we only apply a Band-Aid solution that doesn't actually address indirect drivers. So research and practice in the short term must be linked to the slower work of advocacy and imaginary building that can influence indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And here I mean the social and cultural values and norms, the political institutions, and the economic logics driving biodiversity loss. Finally, power. Through power, convivial conservation recognizes the many dispersed forms of local resistance, but also sees that these must be connected through broader alliance building to confront the often opaque and complex systems that indirectly influence biodiversity loss. So once mapped out, these bottom-up and top-down triangles start to paint a picture of the kind of large-scale change that must be targeted and the alliance building that must be organized across any individual biodiversity impact chain. Finally, I just wanted to introduce the people that are working on this, working on convivial conservation. We're building on decades and decades of critical conservation research that already exists, but we've been catalyzed by the publication of the Conservation Revolution, which is when a lot of people really started gravitating towards this idea of convivial conservation as a concept. So we're trying to build momentum, we're building on this momentum to try and understand convivial conservation from unique contexts around the world. This is where we're working. We're basically connecting the dots, building the evidence, and sharing the story for a more convivial kind of conservation fit for the challenges of the 21st century. Now that's my cue to pass it over to Louise, who would tell you or bring this picture a little bit more to life with her work in Jamaica.
Thanks, Shelby. Yes, so welcome everybody to the Blue Lagoon, which is within the East Portland Fish Sanctuary on the northeast coast of Jamaica. It's run by the Alligator Head Foundation and supported and partnered with the Thyssen Bornemisza Art Contemporary Foundation based in Madrid, who I work with. I think the thing I want to mention at this point is that convivial conservation, as it's being put together through the centre, is very much a research into action and advocacy movement. So there's a lot of research, fascinating, valuable research that's happening that we really want to start making a bridge towards the conservation sector now and saying, actually, it's time to sort of broaden and deepen and indeed politicize our understanding of what transformation means in terms of how it's being articulated by IPBES and then all sorts of other big conservation actors. So what you're looking at is the Blue Lagoon, as I mentioned. It's a 6 kilometre squared no-take zone marine reserve in northeastern Jamaica. The Blue Mountains, which are behind it, are the first national park in Jamaica, rich in endemic species and natural beauty, and these tumble all the way down to the coast of the Caribbean Sea. So if you go to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So the Alligator Head, just a little bit of context for you. It is a community-based marine coral restoration and habitat conservation organization that is managing this government-mandated marine protected area, operating a ridge-to-reef methodology. So it works with farmers and fishers and the tourism sector, looking at the connection between the land and the marine context. It's doing coral microfragmentation and development in nurseries ex situ and then outplanting these, doing coral restoration, habitat monitoring. It's involved in a big coral restoration trans-Caribbean research project with the Nature Conservancy at the moment, founded on a community engagement model, as I said. It's a subsidiary of the Art Research Foundation TBA21, which means that it has an interesting transdisciplinary potential, in fact, where it hosts artists in residencies over periods of time, which we're looking to sort of mobilize in new ways within a living laboratory, convivial conservation living laboratory, which I'll mention in just a moment. And within this sort of broader approach, we're thinking about what would a marine promoted area mean in this context, in a context where there's a lot of conflict at the moment between different groups. There's a very high level of poaching. There's a lot of kind of penalty focused work on restricting the fishing in the area, when of course fishing is a very important livelihood, a social safety net opportunity for people living in economic marginalization and quite high degrees of poverty and food insecurity in this area. So there's a lot of things going on that are trying to be reconciled that we're going to start looking at through this convivial conservation lens. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to briefly expand the framing of telecoupling in three particular ways. What I really noted from the call for papers was this sort of emphasis on rise in living standards since the 1950s, that specifically a lot in the West, that's led to destruction in the global South and biodiversity loss. But of course, we think this goes back a lot longer than just since the 1950s, because it's built on sort of 400 years of colonial wealth transfer from the global South to the global North. Economist Utsa Patnaik, just a few years ago in 2018, published a study from nearly 2 centuries of detailed data on tax and trade that showed how Britain had drained almost $45 trillion in current value from India during the period of 1765 to 1938. Much of that was iron, timber, and tar that was absolutely essential for European industrialization processes. We're also looking at sort of more than 60 or more or less 60 years of post-independence global development architectures. This term plantation economy is used to describe how a typical Caribbean economy works through reference to its historical origins, which have generated an ongoing dependence on the plantation sector, by which we mean sort of foreign-owned and export-oriented. So this is a theory of permanent dependence, of growth without development, and of adjustment without structural change, and diversification without transformation. And this has been mobilized through a suite of financial rules, debt conditionalities, trade liberalization conditions that were imposed specifically, mostly from the 1970s onwards, by the IMF and the World Bank. And so this is the sort of neo-colonial development architecture that, of course, conservation is operating within. And then on top of that, there's this sort of new conservation. Convivial conservation articulates new conservation as this move towards reliance on, or at least huge faith in, the role of private sector finance and markets, or selling nature to save it, which, is done in the name of this sort of funding gap, this pervasive funding gap to meet the Convention for Biological Diversity requirements. But there's quite a lot of very, very good emerging research coming out at the moment. I would point you to Jessica Dempsey, who's talked about, the CBD targets will not be met without financial and tax justice, that shows how, focusing only on these funding gaps completely eclipses the possibility for true transformative change at the root levels of inequality, and the historical contemporary factors that are driving this inequality and which account for sustained social and environmental vulnerability, which of course is incredibly important to further environmental changes, the climate change and so on. So in broad sense, telecoupling and convivial conservation, we would say, means keeping all scales in view at the same time. So this is about ensuring incredibly high level integrity at a program level, through, absolute best practices with participation, diverse traditional and local ecological knowledges, decision-making at the lowest possible level, and so on, but also really keeping in view the broader political and economic connections to different geographic drivers, as Shelby says, working from sort of bottom up and top down at the same time. And so there are just a few interweaving processes that I'm going to try and make visible for you in Jamaica in relation to this. So next slide, please. The first is, as we've heard from some of the previous other speakers, around this sort of inequality, or the framing of who are the real drivers of environmental harm. In a traditional marine protected area, we have absolute restrictions on what people can do for the most part, but in a kind of corporate level, or the sort of extractive interests are often led towards sort of voluntary mechanisms, other types of things which are not, in fact, enforcements. So in Jamaica, there's a history of these no-take zones where fishers are restricted from accessing the traditional fishing grounds. They're supported in many, many ways to access different fishing grounds through access to boats and training and sort of diversification of their marine-based livelihoods. But what is typically overlooked is, in fact, the real estate interests and the scale of landscape change that's going on. So these two pictures are supposed to contrast that. On the right is actually just a tiny snippet of the amount of private second homes that are being built along this coastline, which has got very rapidly increasing land values. You go to the next slide, please. So tourism in Jamaica is incredibly important. So in addition to these sort of rapid real estate developments that we're seeing along this coastline, we're seeing how land and space is being reproduced in line with the sort of national and global class interests of tourism. You know, this idea of escape from modernity from the global north in our highly nature depleted countries towards biodiversity hotspots in the south, through forms of ecotourism and so on. So this is a postcard from the 1980s of the area, Port Antonio in Portland, where we're working. If you go to the next slide, please, Shelby. I think it's interesting, in fact, because this was the birthplace of Caribbean tourism that was built off the back of the banana plantation trade. The boats were moving between this northeast coast of Jamaica, taking bananas to North America and then bringing tourists back. And in fact, on the boats, and that was the beginning of Caribbean tourism. It was the Boston Fruit Company that is now sort of through several mergers and acquisitions is in fact Chiquita Bananas. So Tate and Lyle,
can you please come to an end? Your time is unfortunately running out.
Okay, let's skip through to the next one, Shelby. Next. This is just to highlight the sort of inequality, of course, in land distribution that is still very much dominated towards the plantation sector, the large landowners, and you've got very marginalized farmers. So the blue economy is emerging very rapidly. We see this as both an opportunity potentially, but also a huge risk. Is this going to expand the levels of inequality, reproduce the plantation logic, lead to more forms of enclosure, more forms of economic marginalization? So the living laboratory that we're developing with Alligator Head Foundation is under this premise of like taking back the blue economy through a convivial conservation lens, specifically on this concept of the promoted area. Shelby, if you go. It's a very subtle but potentially enormous shift in meaning. So this moves away from this sort of culture of negation and conflict towards one that really starts from locally based values. How does, how do we promote the values of nature to, in fact, everybody that's living in that space? This means it's broadly inclusive, so it's not just targeting the lower classes who are ecosystem dependent, but in fact, the whole range of people who are operating and in fact impacting that area, so the local private landowners, for example. So promoted areas is really about expanding conservation beyond protection to embrace this full suite of cultural, social, and ecological significance of places, recognizing the deep connections between people and nature. So if you go for the next slide, please.
Please, I think you really need to wrap up.
Yeah. Okay. I'll probably just skip. Yeah, please just go to the last slide and we can just show the references and the links to where you can find out more about all of these projects and emerging practices. So thanks very much for listening.
Thanks as well from my side to Louise and Shelby. This was a very nice additional view to the previous three presentations. And I would welcome, as I also don't see any direct questions and answer, I would ask Jens Newig and Sébastien-Pierre Boillat to also come to the big screen, or the Lindemann to put them. Yes, so great. And as long as we now wait for questions from the audience, all of you are highly welcome to ask questions or make contributions yourself. I would just start the discussion. From the last presentation, I was wondering, we were listening that a new concept is needed for how we look at conservation and a new theory of change, how to come to conservation while maintaining justice. The question to Sebastian and Jens, what do you think? Do we need completely different theories of change? Yes, please.
I can maybe start with sort of some thoughts that I developed during while listening. So it seems to me that sort of this whole issue of it's a scale issue also, right? Sort of what about local concerns, concerns of, let's say, the country, let's say national concerns, or those of the international community, if that term is appropriate at all, of course. And that seems to me not something that is easily resolvable, right? So if we think of like also at a recent conference where I just was, where it is about timber trade with Indonesia, and like the issue came up. So how can the European Union dare regulate deforestation in Indonesia, and is this not sort of totally neo-colonial and so on? So on the other hand, sort of deforestation is going on there for the sort of palm oil, for example. So what to do, right? If we want to save the planet, but also local communities, and does that go together? So I think that's something that is not easy at all, and I'm not so sure if also the approach that the two of you just portrayed, sort of what about these global issues? Is it taking account of these, or is it sort of the local communities what counts? I'm not sure. I think somehow it needs to be brought together, and it's vastly uneasy, I think.
So Louise and Shelby,
happy to hear more.
Shelby, how do you integrate the global aspects in your approach?
The premise, I mean, if I may start, I mean, it aligns very much with degrowth economics, which again is also a relatively new area that a lot of research is being done on. And I think the first, criticism anybody would have with degrowth, it's like, well, hang on, what about the material growth in energy use and material wealth that is, of course, required for a huge part of the global population? And this is exactly what convivial conservation seeks to address, and what I was trying to highlight there within the sort of need to problematize and politicize the global architectures of development, and historically informed so, in order to give space and autonomy and capacity and sovereignty to these countries to increase their economic development needs, whilst contracting their very high levels of consumption, extraordinary inequality and concentration of wealth in a tiny minority of a global population. So it's not easy, of course. This is like how to turn an ocean liner that has so much power embedded in it, and that was just highlighted by so many of those case studies that you presented. But until we start having these conversations and mainstreaming them actually through the conservation sector as well, that is not literate, in fact, on these topics, that we don't even stand a chance. And I think convivial conservation wishes to really mobilize and build alliances with a very diverse network of people and bring the conservation sector back into this sort of point of problematizing, rather than a consensus approach, which is what defines the neoliberal status quo, of course, which is always alignment, consensus, and sort of anti-politics. So I hope that maybe responds slightly without really giving a proper answer. But
Thank you. I now see that in the chat there are questions coming, so I'm reading them. Thanks. As an ecologist, I very much enjoyed your talks on environmental justice. I would be interested to learn what you, the specialists, think about the EU PCD concept, policy coherence for development. Is it adequate, sufficient to tackle the challenges you mentioned, or what should be changed, added? Not sure who can answer. Anybody wants to step in? Know something about the policy coherence concept? If does not seem to be the case, right? So then I go to the next question. It is to Louise Carver. What roles does tourism play and how can it contribute to biodiversity conservation? Or are the general impacts just too high? How can local communities be more included in ecotourism and benefit from that?
Yes, big question. I mean, it's the whole agenda with sort of regenerative tourism, community-based livelihoods. First of all, increasing kind of democratic representation of local communities' interests would be one step in order to be able to consult appropriately with associations and groups. Ensuring and emphasizing that the local businesses are indeed prioritized. I mean, in Jamaica, a big problem is all-inclusive hotels that don't, in fact, distribute much of the money and potentially offshore a lot of the value, paying people very low wages as well. I mean, some of the problems is the degree to which conservation and tourism have become so entangled. For instance, in the Ministry of Conservation or Environment in Kenya is in fact the same ministry as conservation, because conservation is the kind of main tourist product, but it's also using that to fund the conservation itself, which means disentangling these very difficult, colonial relationships between formations of land and so on. And again, just keeping a kind of very political, historical perspective on how these things have come together, how conservation is being driven by tourism revenue because it's funding the protection, which of course is making it into a product for the tourism rather than as a primary value rather than something else. Again, not a particularly quick answer. We haven't started looking at this in depth yet in Jamaica, but we hope that we'll be building a critical friend partnership with the Sandals Hotel that's actually about to open within the Marine Reserve. That is soon going to be removing all those people that you saw swimming in the Blue Lagoon because it's taking over that site. So
maybe if I can just add, not specifically to Jamaica, but ecotourism more broadly, there is a literature on convivial tourism. It's actually how I ended up discovering convivial conservation. So to whomever asked that question, that might be something to look into as well. I know it relates a lot, connects a lot to the degrowth arguments as well, and these ideas around slower travel and not looking to equate ecotourism with exotic jet setting across the world for a weekend vacation as well.
if I may just also make a brief comment.
May I maybe go further, because we have so many other questions also to other speakers. So here I have a question to Jens. Somebody is asking, you showed a timeline of initiatives that came mostly from NGOs and corporates, but government policies were surprisingly absent, except for a supply chain law. Why do you think it is the case that government politics are so slow to react, even though they seem to have backing from both society, NGOs, as well as corporates, who wish for a level playing field? What other external pressures are needed to encourage governments to take action?
Yeah, good question. So I think what I showed on this one slide, this timeline, those were like deliberately just non-governmental initiatives. So mostly private and or with NGOs, for example. So and the question is what can governments do? So and I wouldn't say this is a hopeless case. So I think there is quite a bit of governmental action. The question is, has it had really effects, for example? And what is, I think, most difficult to research, or where we simply don't know yet where we're standing, is this interplay of these different governance initiatives. So we know quite a bit about the labeling and the private approaches, and we know, well, I wouldn't say they completely failed, but they have had surprisingly little effect, both in a social justice function, but also in an environmental sense. But we're seeing, of course, that governments, both in producing countries, but also internationally or from the global north, there are these governance initiatives, and I presented some of them on the last slides, but there's also quite a bit ongoing in countries like Brazil, for example. Brazil has one of the strictest forest codes worldwide. But then many say, well, it's not really being implemented. So what about this interplay of different policy initiatives from different fields? How is that interwoven with interests by corporations, but also by local NGOs, for example? So I think we simply don't know enough yet about how this works. So this is probably sort of my little bottom line here. And well, there are projects like the one I'm involved in right now, where we try to look at these interactions between the different policies in the next years, and we'll probably be a little bit smarter in 5 or 10 years.
Thanks.
It's not too late then.
Yeah. And I have a last question to Sébastien about the concept of telecoupling. Is local and tele not very fluid and arbitrary? If you look, for example, at pit mining in Germany, the local communities suffer for the national wealth. What about conflicts within local communities? Is it not essentially the individual the ultimate subject of justice? And please, a short answer, because time is running out.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, of course. I mean, the subject of justice is key. I know your work as well. So, we can expand the subject. You can have the individual. You can have also a community. You can have also non-humans or more than humans. Actually, the idea of justice doesn't solve you the conflict. I think we also have to be aware of that, because every actor can squeeze the justice for himself. but it opens up. I see it more as something that opens up dialogue. You know? When we say, okay, we all strive to justice, so let's talk. So I see it more as an integrative concept than a fits-for-all concept. And of course, there is the so-called 3I approach. We have intergenerational, international, intergenerational, and well, I don't remember the 3, but the idea is basically that justice is, you can expand it in non-human communities. You can expand it to also more than individuals, also communities and countries and different level. And you can also expand it in time. You can expand it to future generation, but also to past generation. And for some culture, the respect to ancestors, for example, is very important. So yes, there is also justice for past generations. So I think we will never agree exactly on who are the subject of justice, but at least we can also put the cards on the table and start talking. So that's how I see it.
Thanks a lot.
And perhaps a last comment also about the initiative also, because I didn't respond to the initial question, this idea of doing convivial conservation. I see it really very interesting, and I also want to congratulate this team. I find it very exciting, very, very interesting. I think the idea is really to take a relational perspective with the non-humans or more than humans, and also among different communities. So it's very welcome. But the thing where I see a little bit the challenge is that, again, we are based in, okay, it's an international network. Again, we are also still telecoupled. We are still living or funding also from Europe, mainly as researchers. So we are also, in some sense, part of this post-colonial system. And sometimes it's also very contradictory when you go to the global south and you ask local conservationists to do more relational conservation, you are confronting yourself with local staff who have a more colonial vision. No? And sometimes they can even turn the argument to you, and they can say, well, why you from Europe are you imposing us to do more inclusive conservation?
Yeah.
And that's something we are always confronted in the field, because there is this game of who is controlling whom, and there's a long way to come, because coloniality is not only north-south, it's also governmentality. It's also something that is deeply entrenched. Even working with indigenous peoples, when I work with indigenous peoples in Bolivia, for example, they value a lot what is Pachamama and Mother Earth and these things. But at some point, we went to work also with a community who were all converted to evangelical churches, and they told us Pachamama is poverty. We don't want to talk about that, because for us it's like the opposite that we want.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, I think I will stop here, and thank you to everybody.
Thanks. That was really a great final remark, I would say. And thanks a lot from my side. Tanja Busse is already here again. So it means that time is really running up. That's really a pity, because I would have loved to continue this discussion here. So thanks to all the four of you, to five, also Grace Wong. And I hand over to Tanja Busse again.
Thank you, Flurina, and thank you so much to all of you. And actually, I can only agree. We just started a discussion, and now it's already stopped. The time is over, but we have seen that there are lots more questions to clarify. And we both mentioned the idea of the mindset, and also the idea, you all mentioned the idea of the mindset, and also the idea of power. And we know convivialism might be a great concept, but we have to give more power to it. And I was wondering whether the idea of the rights of nature might give more power to this idea, and let's see what the future brings about new ideas that courts can also help this concept. But as we all see, there are a lot of open questions, and so far there is no good solution, unfortunately. And someone of you said, if that's not too late when we know more in a few years. So let's hurry up in finding good solutions. I invite you to a short coffee break, and we will be back in 15 minutes to start the next plenary session, which will be about the traditional and local knowledge, which is very, very nice, because we just started to talk about this knowledge and also the concepts behind these knowledges, and the way we treat nature with our mindsets. So have a very short and very nice coffee break, and be back in about 10 minutes. We will start, well, nearly early. We will start in 10 minutes and have a nice break. See you then, and I hope you will all be back, even though I took some of your time. Thank you so much.